Very warm welcome to everyone. Thanks very much for coming along. My name is Austin Williams, and this is the Bookshop Barnie. We're going to be discussing this book, which is David Spiegelhalter's book, which is The Art of Uncertainty, How to Navigate Chance, Ignorance, Risk, and Luck. And for those of you who have forgotten the glorious isolation of COVID, this kind of online event is a reminder, especially as I like you to turn off your microphones if you would, just for the full sensory deprivation remembrance, and we'll let David stimulate you back into reality. So Sir David, knighted in 2014, is Emeritus Professor of Statistics in the Centre for Mathematical Sciences at the University of Cambridge, and is also the non-executive director of the UK Statistics Authority. Spiegelhalter translates from the German as mirror holder, and Professor Spiegelhalter regularly holds a mirror up to society. By the way, David translates as beloved, but that's a little bit too sycophantic for tonight. Incidentally, my name, Austin Williams, translates as he who must be obeyed. So bear that in mind. Statistics is a much more common aspect of the news these days. Stories about fake statistics are up by 27.376%, I've heard. And this week, we learned that the number of heroin addicts is shooting up. Anyway, this is a fascinating book. It's very easy to read. Thank you very much, David. It's very easy to read. It's as I was saying to David earlier, it's a challenging book, but very rewarding, I think, and examines how facts and assumptions are presented in public discourse. David says that we should have, quotes, humility to be not so confident about our judgments that we blind ourselves to evidence that might be pointing in another direction. So in preparation for this, as well as reading the book, I watched David on Desert Island Discs, which simply taught me that David's mathematical genius is in inverse proportion to his taste in music. But we can talk about that later, maybe. So look, this is an opportunity to constructively engage in the issues raised in the book. And even if you're unsure of the question, give it a go, because statistics is the art of never having to say you're certain. So the way it works is I've asked David to present 5 minutes on the theme of the book. It's a 400-page stonker, so it'll be a tough call. But then I'll raise some questions for about 25 minutes or so, just to allow David to flesh out the arguments. Then it's over to you, the audience, just for questions, comments, and observations. Please remember, comments are welcome. There's a couple of messages in the chat room to say where to buy the book. I'm sure you know anyway, but let's pass it over to you, David. Before we do, if you want to unmute everyone, give him a round of applause before he starts. It's always good to get the applause in first. There you go. Thank you. Let's go. Okay, David, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Austin. It's a great pleasure to be here. And it was slightly worrying. It's easy to speak to a very, big audience, just faces in the crowd, but I do feel this is actually more like a sort of interrogation, like a job interview. So anyway, I shall do my best. Okay, book. It actually started with this book, The Art of Statistics, which I did for Pelican 2019, and it was very successful. Translated into 11 languages, sold masses of copies. Actually, for once, I made some money out of it because, before that, I'd made a sort of specialty of writing popular books, which is very nice to see them on shelves, but didn't actually make any money. So, because that was so successful, they allowed me to do this one, which is, a great tome like this, which contains all sorts of stuff I'm interested in. And if anyone's read it, you'll realize it is quite personal. I mention myself, my family, my kids, and it all. But I hope in a relevant way, because uncertainty is something that just runs through all our lives. So the point of the book is to, first of all, actually just face up to what does uncertainty mean, what sort of forms it takes, and then how might we better be dealing with it. Now, I'm not a psychologist. It's not a self-help book, although there is some, relevant bits on that, I think. But it's more about sort of actually facing up to uncertainty and trying to think slowly about not knowing. That was a phrase I made up, which I thought wasn't too bad. So uncertainty, I defined quite early on, is the conscious awareness of ignorance, and which I stole from somebody else. But I think what it emphasized by saying it's to do with ignorance is that it emphasizes that it's not a property of the outside world. Maybe the world is all predetermined. Maybe it's all just either God's will or some great big mechanical clockwork effort. I don't care. And I don't even bother to talk about it, because the crucial thing is I don't know what's going on, and I don't know what's going to happen, and what happened and why it did. So right from the beginning, I talk about uncertainty as a personal relationship with the outside world. It's a relationship. It's not a property of the outside world. It's a relationship with the outside world, except possibly at the quantum level, which I don't deal with. Although I could talk about that a bit more if you wish. So basically it means then we have to think about it, and I show examples where if we just don't think about it very carefully and just use words like might and could and perhaps, how badly wrong we could go. And so we should try to quantify uncertainty when we can. And this naturally leads us to probability, and not probability just in the sense of flipping coins, although I do talk about that, but probability in the sense of what are known as subjective probabilities, just our own judgments. I think it's 70-30 that someone's going to win a match, or that something's going to happen in the next 5 years. Just my judgment. And so I talk quite a lot about how we can make those judgments, how valuable it is to make those judgments, how they then can be checked, how scored, evaluated when we find out whether what actually happened. But the crucial thing is we don't say what's going to happen. We don't predict actually an event. We always just give everything a probability. And so that leads naturally to discussion of probability theory. Gets a little bit mathematical, although I try to keep the maths to the minimum and in the appendix. And it's sort of leavened with chapters on luck and coincidences, which fascinate me. And those sorts of things. And then it does get in a bit heavier, because I do start talking about statistical modeling, the whole, especially related to COVID, which is going on all the time, the R number, where did that come from, and all that, and all the disagreement between different groups. They all came up with different R numbers, and how do they deal with that? So and I do with climate change and the uncertainties there, and all the efforts to, in a way, tame uncertainty. And my argument is that actually we haven't tamed it, that all these claimed models and intervals and predictions, they're all inadequate. They're all based on assumptions which are frankly untrue. And so we always have to bring our judgment into any analysis, because everything that's quoted to us is always too optimistic. It doesn't take into account all the uncertainties. And then, having sort of discussed statistical modeling, I really start knocking it down when I get into ideas of deep uncertainty, which is, I find fascinating. As someone who was brought up in a sort of much more very mathematical framework where everything's specified and everything's quantified, what do we do when we can't even imagine all the things that might happen, let alone put probabilities on them? And I think that's, reality. We can't specify all the options or everything that might happen. Well, almost certainly whatever happens is something we didn't think of. And how might we go about dealing with that, which is a very topical issue in all sorts of areas. And in between, I talk about causality, how we increasingly are doing attribution studies, where we say, what's the probability that something caused something else? What's the probability that man-made climate change caused the hot autumn in 2023? That which people are now doing those sorts of calculations. Now, whether you believe them or not is another matter, but I do describe how people do go about those analyses, attribution analyses. And then I talk a bit about communication, risk communication, how bad it is a lot of the time and how it could be done better. And then, talk about some future ideas, what's going to happen, future about AI. Are the killer robots going to come and get us? Is the whole world going to end before the end of the century? Because people put probabilities on that. Again, whether we believe them or not, and I certainly won't be around to check them. But somebody will be. And so I think it's rather important. So I do talk about predictions, predicting football results in a quite nice, closed, easy, comfortable world, but making predictions in areas that are not so comfortable when we can't even list the possibilities. So I try to leaven it with some stories, a lot of personal stories about, which I hope are faintly interesting. And Austin might want to ask me about my conception, which I've analyzed in great detail, and so on. So, and that's it.
Very good.
We'll come on to that, who it's for, I'm sure, in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Well, look, I'm not going to touch your conception, if you excuse the expression, but I think I saw one of your videos which was saying that we all, however old we are, we still don't even want to think about that.
Yeah,
On the
parents
table.
having sex, I
Yeah,
know.
yeah, you had to drop it in. No,
Yeah.
but well, look, I thought I'd start just very quickly because I know you've done like the title with this chance, ignorance, risk, and luck. I just plumped for luck. I took a lucky dip, came up with that
Mm.
one. And you talk about constitutive luck
Yeah, yeah.
being the most important. That idea of being born, with a silver spoon, I suppose. I just
Mm.
wondered
Or not.
whether or not. Well, that's the point. So, is luck just luck, or should we, this kind of commonplace idea that we should apologize for the privilege that certain, births bring? Where do you sit on that kind of conversation?
Well, you're right. People have, as philosophers have thought about different forms of luck, and I talk about those quite a lot. And the most basic, and I believe the most important, is constitutive luck, which is just who you're born as, your privileges or lack of. Into what place are you born, who your family is, what period of history, where you are, what your genes are, your early upbringing. All these things are over which you have zero control, and yet have enormous influence going into the future. And I know that's true for me. I was an enormous privilege, not in terms of, parents having money or anything like that, just purely the time and place I was born in, was a generation that then went on to have a lot of good fortune. So, and then there's the other sort of luck. And then next we go on to circumstantial luck, which is just being at the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time. For example, I tell a story of my grandfather, who was brigade gas officer just north of Passchendaele in early 1918, which was definitely being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then the final thing is outcome luck, which is how it just happens to work out for you. Again, luck is just things that happen to you, no control over them. They're unpredictable and have a big impact. That's what we think about as luck. So just things that just hit us. And outcome luck, some people, do okay and some people don't, just through no control of their own. The shell that blew up my grandfather was far enough away so that he was just invalided back out of the front line, and that saved his life. And therefore, I'm here. And otherwise, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be telling the story. And
And
that
he
was
came,
his outcome luck.
and he came back like a week before the Somme or something, wasn't it?
Well, his point is that meanwhile his battalion had been their next posting was to go to the Somme in March 1918, which was a quiet sector, except it was about to meet 1 million German soldiers in the Kaiser's offensive. And I looked at my father found the movements of his battalion in the Lancashire Fusiliers, and they had to do a rearguard action and go over the top twice in counterattacks. And my grandfather was a second lieutenant. He would have been first up the ladder, blowing his little whistle, and I wouldn't be here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll say amen to that. But so that's look. I'm not going to push it. That's my white guilt question over and done with. You didn't bite exactly, but we'll move on. We'll see whether I can draw you in next time. So the next one is where I probably will annoy you. Is I'm going to quote Mark Twain.
No.
Lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yeah.
No, but because it is a truth that people view statistics or general facts, you could say, with skepticism. And
Well, yeah, I don't think it depends who's telling them. I mean, I view a lot of it. As soon as I hear a statistic in the news, I don't believe a word of it. Immediately, my suspicion hackles go up, because if someone quotes a statistic at me in the news, I know they're trying to manipulate my emotions. They're trying to make me scared or reassured or something like that, because they're used as rhetorical devices to try to persuade me of one thing or another. And therefore, it's quite right, when they are being used in that way, to be deeply skeptical. And so that's why I'm actually on the board of the UK Statistics Authority that controls the Office for National Statistics. So it's in my huge interest in that organisation not to tell lies, to actually be reliable, or what is just being trustworthy. And, I'm sure you're fully aware of the code of practice for national statistics, which is possibly the dullest publication ever. It's immensely important because it sets the standards, what are the basic principles behind the statistics in this country. And there are 3 pillars: trustworthiness, quality, and value. But the main one is trustworthiness. And that's absolutely crucial. And actually, the trust in UK official statistics is high. public trust is high, quite rightly, because everyone does their best. They struggle, it's really difficult to get employment and labour force statistics at the moment because nobody's answering the surveys anymore.
Exactly.
But they do their best. But so I think that's why I can't stand, I think, that statement, whoever said it, is absolutely stupid, because he's putting a complete generality about something that is absolutely vital, which is information and facts.
Yeah,
I do agree that one should be
sorry.
certainly very cautious about accepting them when they're being used in arguments.
No, look, I mean, I'm an architect. We have similar code of conducts that you can believe or not believe. We have integrity and honesty on top of your ones. But they're there as a framework. I was only going to ask you about the reasons for writing this book, as to whether, because there is this, seems to be, you can correct me if I'm wrong, this kind of bandwagon of conspiracies, or at least we're told that there are. I wondered whether this book was trying to give some mechanisms for people to maybe work things out for themselves.
Is more art of stats deals much more with questioning what we're told, the trustworthiness of claims, because the stuff we hear, especially on social media, so much of it is false claims. And so that book actually deals in much more detail with the sort of questions to ask about the evidence being presented, in order to decide its trustworthiness, to assess that trust. The art of uncertainty isn't so much on that at all. It's not really about critiquing claims. I could talk about that for hours if you want, but that's not what this book is about.
No, tell me what it's about then. That's where I took a lot of that from it, to be honest.
Well, you're right. You're right. It does deal with that, and so, but it doesn't actually give a sort of checklist for what to do, which the previous book does. But it does actually kind of warn you about claims being made based on some models, statistical models, which have got a lot of assumptions behind them. And that is a lot about that, about being cautious, if not skeptical, about a lot of that. However, in the end, it's got to be done, because we can't go out and measure everything. We have to try to make some sort of inferences, some sort of, and there's always judgments involved. And for me, the crucial thing, the question I ask is, who's telling me this? What is the source, and are they trustworthy, or are they trying to manipulate me? So far more important than the number or where they got it from is, who is it? And why are they telling me this? What do they want me to feel on the basis of this number? And that, I realize, is the most important thing, which is, of course, one should apply to everything one's told, because it's questioning the trustworthiness of the source.
Okay.
So for me, I go through all of that before I even look at the number.
Yeah. But we'll move our way on to talk about that as the general theme, I think, of the book, in my interpretation anyway. But I just wondered if you could just give us an example. When I was reading and again, from my perspective, I was looking at it from a civil liberties perspective when you talked about the facial recognition example, which I thought was really, really telling. So you're analyzing it from a scientific statistician's perspective, but the consequences were that, if we are monitored in a public square, where the more people that there are, the more innocent people than suspect people may be picked up. Do you want to just give us a brief?
Yeah, it's kind of untrue, because facial recognition systems are improving, and they might be claimed to be 90% accurate, meaning that they will actually, if someone's on the checklist, the watch list, so as they say, there might be actually 70-90% chance of actually spotting them in a crowd, but there's a false positive rate, and that might be only one in 1,000. But if the crowd is big enough, and you look at enough people, those false positives can outnumber easily the number of true positives that are picked out. And so you only need a very small false positive rate in order to make most of your cases being false positive, most of your findings, which shows that, but that's common. That's the same for every screening test. It's the same for breast cancer screening. Every screening test for for something that's fairly rare will usually generate more false positives than true positives. So that means you've got to be very cautious about interpreting screening tests of this type or any other. And if people know that, it's fine. It's if people say, oh, this is 90% accurate, and therefore, oh, it's gone ping, therefore there's 90% chance this person is who we're looking for. Well, no. And it's too easy to make that reverse logic, which is just wrong. And I mean, I use various phrases which I've used before that, you know, if you're looking for a needle in a haystack, then most of what looks like needles will turn out to be straw. So, you know, if something's rare, then they're very difficult to find. And your screening test has to be extraordinarily good.
Very good. Okay. So look, speaking of extraordinarily accurate, you wrote, I think you said it was December 2023, that the probability of Donald Trump winning the 2024 US presidential election is about 40%.
It was about 40% then.
40%.
Yeah.
Not a bad effort, David. Not a bad effort. Well done.
Well, no, it's not my effort. It was just what
no,
was it?
I know, but what I want to say is that if you were a Guardian journalist, you'd probably think it was 0% chance. Yeah, Kamala Harris is going to walk it. So I just want to understand the probability, how probabilities are actually work. Are they scientific? Are they socially constructed? We all know there's biases, but
I mean, that's not from a formula. That's by looking at the betting exchanges. It was just the odds being offered. So that was, yeah, I can't remember who, were those Ladbrokes? I can't remember who I looked at, but I looked at a few betting exchanges which give you a whole list of who, you know, what odds were being offered. So that was that is completely socially constructed because it's based on what people are betting. It's essentially a wisdom of crowds. Whether it's wisdom or not is another matter. But that reflected the odds that were, you know, where people on a betting exchange, people are willing to lay the bet or take the bet, and so that was what it was at the time, and so that probability, of course, it doesn't exist. There's no true probability. In fact, I don't believe there's any true probabilities at all. All probabilities are constructed, as far as that's what one of the arguments in the book. They don't exist. We made probability up. It's not there. So I have a fairly extreme view on this that not all my colleagues agree with. But certainly probabilities like that, you can't say there's not some true probability out there, if only we could find it. So you don't estimate probabilities, you assess them on the basis of the evidence. And that 40% was just the composite assessment of the crowd at the time.
Okay. All right. Well, there may be questions coming in on that very point. Just to move on, in terms of one of the general ideas that you've, again, for me, came across was you say there's a danger of using words to express magnitude, whether it's risk or probability, whatever it might be, because there's a danger of misinterpretation. And you prefer kind of numbers, percentages to give that indication.
Rough ones.
Yeah. But it's like when something's statistically likely to happen, again, this is an IPCC number, you say that it refers to 66% and above chance of happening. To me, 66% doesn't seem very likely at all as it happens, but maybe that's just my interpretation. But there's a growing trend in policymakers. Let me just move that question on a little bit, which is the nudge unit, as you're fully aware of, the behavioral insights team. When they were presenting their data, they would actually kind of using numbers, next slide please, to actually kind of have an impact on the way that people behaved. And you can see that within the IPCC guidelines, the climate change guidelines, which you kind of talk about a little bit. They say we should all be, it's a quotation, they say we should be aware that saying a 10% chance of dying is interpreted more negatively than a 90% chance of surviving. So I'm just wondering whether numbers as well as words can be spun for good or ill.
Again, I spend a lot of time in there about the spinning of numbers. You know, just loads of examples that numbers, how they're used to manipulate our feelings. And the standard one you described is framing, you know, whether it's a positive frame or a negative frame, whether you talk about 10% mortality rate or 90% survival, and those generate very different emotions. That is absolutely standard in communication, which is why when you're communicating, you should always say the whole. You know, I don't like just saying 30% of chance of success. You should then say 70% chance of failure, 30-70. So you do the whole part to whole comparison. Well, I mean, because IPCC do this, but the other people who do this are MI5. I've got a JTAC, was a Joint Terrorism Committee. I gave it to, this is the MI5 mug, an official one, which I got when I gave a talk at MI5. And that tells me that when they say something is likely, they mean between 55 and 75% probability. So, and I give examples in the book of how actually things have gone disastrously wrong when people have just used words, because as you say, or if to you likely doesn't mean that, which is why you shouldn't use words just like likely without tethering, at least roughly, so that people have an agreement of what they might mean. So I feel that very strongly, and the intelligence community does as well, because they do not want people just to say, oh, it's likely or it could happen or something like that. Absolutely not. It's disastrous.
But that's, yeah, but like I say, for me, the 66% didn't even seem very likely. But I suppose it's a CIA mug half full conversation, isn't it? Really, where we work out where we sit on these things, depending on what our original thoughts might be. But I just wanted to talk to you about, following on from that, the forecasters who predict the end of civilization, not Extinction Rebellion, who said we'll all be dead by 2025, but you quote astronomer Royal Martin Rees and a few others. He said there was a 50-50% chance of surviving this century. And you say that that kind of probability is nothing more than an expression of concern, personal anxiety, wherever it might be, rather than a statistical analysis. But we've got a bit of a problem, don't we, when science is politicized? And you go on to quote the Union of Concerned Scientists, and in my understanding of them, they're very politicized environmental activists.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
there's science, and then there seems to be kind of politicized science. And how do we discern these things? How do we?
It's very tricky. And I spend a lot of time talking to my colleagues about this, about how some scientists have got a strong agenda one way or another. And this can influence the way they present the result, what the work they do and the way they present the results. And so I feel strongly that that's not appropriate, and that scientists are quite happy. I don't mind if scientists join a clearly politicized organization like historically the Union of Concerned Scientists, because then it's quite clear that this is a pressure group with an agenda. And so I think that's fine if they want to do that, because you sort of know what their agenda is. It's when agendas are sort of hidden behind claims that people make. And I mean, in particular, say about public health measures and things like that, you might have the way you interpret alcohol studies and things like that is terrible. So I do feel quite strongly about this, that again, it comes down to trustworthiness. And the questions to ask about that is, again, is this person trying to persuade me of something, or are they genuinely trying to inform me in order to empower me to make better decisions? And quite a lot of scientists do feel that it's okay to actually try to persuade people of things. But medics, it's quite different, because it's in the official medical guidelines that everyone signs up to, that they should be advocates. They should be advocates of improving public health. So that's, for me, is a bit tricky, because it does mean that they, can validly say, I'm a doctor, so I can advocate for particular policies. And again, I think, well, okay, you can do that, but at least try to make clear that that's what you're doing.
Yeah. Oh, well, I hate to break it to you, but the RIBA, the Royal Institution of British Architects, has made it a mandate that we advocate for climate change or climate literacy or whatever we want to call it. Now, agree or disagree with the reality, I think the advocacy of that goes slightly beyond the impartiality that should be permitted.
I don't know why should RIBA be impartial? They're very partial, I'm sure, in many ways. They got all sorts of policies that they'd want to implement.
No, don't get me started. Anyway, so look, well, speaking of partiality, let's just quickly say I may be taking your comment I am taking it out of context, but let me just say it anyway, because you talk about you can explain it to the audience. You talk about settled science, and obviously there's a standard phrase that, the science is never settled. So I just wanted you to, you said we're talking about a body of confirmed knowledge that you say is good enough for most of us. So I just wanted you to draw out what you meant by that and how that fits into the development of knowledge per se.
Oh, do I say that? Yeah, I think that there is a body of science that is well understood, that I think everyone could generally agree on. But the point is that that's not what scientists work on. They're always working on stuff that we don't know about, and otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. And so the science that's being talked about and being reported and being published is always at the frontier where there's a lot more uncertainty, a lot more argument, a lot more disagreement. And that's inevitable. That's what it is. But science should work. If it works correctly, it should be a self-correcting mechanism so that, in a way, faulty claims should be then tested. That's the crucial thing, is that when someone makes a claim, someone else should be testing it, and should then actually be overcome by the weight of evidence. That's what should happen. And that's why, in fact, I mean, certainly in the medical area, no, it's not like a single study will ever decide anything. You're always, people will be putting together the evidence, doing a meta-analysis or whatever. And so there's a study shows, I think, oh, for God's sake. No, it doesn't. A study claims, but come on, I want to see how that fits in with the composite of evidence. So the crucial thing is that it's a cumulative, science is a cumulative thing rather than, oh, breakthrough, this study shows. No, you've got to be able to, you aggregate the evidence into a whole, and should converge to something that's a bit better.
Yeah, but there is a distinction in society that there are scientists, as you say, doing that, and then there's punters like me not doing that, and there's a general level of understanding required of me of science, which is far less than required of
I
the
think so, and I
experts.
think that's what I mean. I don't think that people need to know. I don't know much science at all. I don't think people need to know much science. I think what people should understand more is the scientific method. To do with experimentation, to do with self-correction, to do with the limitations of claims of any particular study, the need for replication, and so on. And that, I think, would be an extremely good thing.
Okay. But because actually the COVID, I mean, I have read your previous book as well, but I think I'm discussing this one, so don't hold up the other book again. Is that COVID did damage trust in science and scientists, didn't it? And I think that
if for some people, yes, yeah.
Well, no, of course,
And not all scientists acted, particularly admirably, I think.
No, but I'm saying, I mean, obviously, I'm not giving this a 100% certainty on my prediction, but I'm just saying that there is a mistrust. There has been an element of skepticism. I mean, in some ways, there's been a rise of those kind of very BBC verified type programs, which does indicate that they are trying to kind of redress the balance over tipping into skepticism. But I was wondering whether, the harm that it's done in some ways to science, I hope that you agree that there has been some kind of damage done there. What we can do to maybe redress that?
Again, it's by being trustworthy. I mention in both books the philosopher Honora O'Neill, who I'm a huge admirer of, who wrote a lot about trust. And her basic thing is to say that nobody should be going around saying, how can we get people to trust us? That's just the wrong question to ask. What we should be asking ourselves is, how can we demonstrate trustworthiness? So I think the business is to be trustworthy, and part of that is that the science should be communicated in a way that doesn't promote an policy agenda.
Well, no, well, I completely agree with you, but I suppose what I'm trying to ask is that, especially since you say we don't need precautionary principle for dealing with uncertainty, we shouldn't be reckless. Yes, we should be trustworthy. I get all that. I'm just wondering, the fact that you saying that is fine, but there is a development or a dominant narrative in some ways of risk aversion of the precautionary principle. So I'm just simply asking you to try to explain to me why
that's
you
why I
think
do
that has
deal with
happened.
it. I argue against the precautionary principle as a principle. What I do say is that in situations of bigger uncertainty, that it's reasonable to be cautious until we know more, and that's a perfectly rational response. You don't need an extra principle there. It's just
No,
that.
but I'm simply saying, why do you think that's grown as a
I
dominant
see. Yeah.
perspective?
No, I think you could say. Well, let me see. Yeah. No, I think that. Yeah, I mean, I think that some decisions in the past haven't been great in many ways. And there's been a lot of advocacy, and I think that, as I talk about quite a lot in the book, about we need to be, to communicate transparently about what we don't know, and that any recommendations, any policy are provisional. and are likely to change as we gain more evidence. So I mentioned explicitly COVID in that case, and how I felt that politicians were being untrustworthy by making a commitment to a policy which then they were stuck with because they'd be accused of a U-turn. And how I hold up the example of John Krebs, the Food Standards Agency, who set up a sort of checklist to go through in a crisis where there was a lot of uncertainty, in which you should say what you do know, then say what you don't know, be open about it, what you're doing to find out, what the public can do in the meantime to be on the safe side, because until we do, well, with a lot of uncertainty, it's reasonable to be cautious, but only as a temporary provision, because the crucial thing is the fifth step, say, we will come back to you later, things will change, our advice will change. And John Krebs did that all the time through BSE and foot and mouth and every damn disaster you could ever think of. And it was enormously trustworthy. So I just point to these Krebs principles all the time. And I watch whenever, in a crisis, I watch who's ever, whether people are doing it. And I think politicians find it incredibly difficult to admit provisionality. So a year into COVID, where everyone's sort of wiping their surfaces and all this nonsense, which they could have known within a couple of months was a waste of time.
But no, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, David. But like as you're saying there, that like politicians were saying trust the science, in some ways passing the buck onto scientists.
Yeah, terrible.
I mean, I hold in scientists in inverted commas there, but how are scientists now fighting back by saying we're actually uncertain, therefore you can't blame us?
No, because the scientists at the time, this thing of trust, we're following the science, is such nonsense. And, people at the time said this is ridiculous because you don't follow the science. Science doesn't tell you what to do in any way at all. Science only looks at one particular aspect, so it can't tell you what to do. Those are political decisions that have to weigh up a much bigger picture than any particular scientific investigation can tell you. So that you're absolutely right. This phrase like we're following the science is purely an attempt to pass the buck, which scientists should quite rightly refuse to take on. And I think to a large extent, they did. There were scientist advocates out there, but I think to a large extent, most people refused to take on that mantle, quite rightly, absolutely refused. Yeah. And so so I think that was the right thing to do.
All right, very good, very good. All right, look, I've got a whole welter of other questions, but I'll give you time to settle into your study. I'll take questions from the audience. I've got some coming up on the what do you call it, the chat function, some of which I don't even understand myself. But so we've got this one. I'll read out just for the recording. It says this is from Terry. Is this a question? Let me pose it as a question. I recall A.T. Jaynes advocating that all available information should be included in making a judgment, in this way avoiding ideology. In controversial matters, of course, for example, that involve sex or ethnicity, using all information is prohibited. Google, for example, takes this as far as lying. Well, we may not get into the Google conversation, but are you seeing that there's a cancel culture type ethic occurring in science at all?
It's not what I'm working on. Sorry.
You are allowed to.
There's nothing about that in the book at all.
No,
we're talking about the book.
That's true. All right. Okay. All right. Well, I found out where that question was going as I read it. So, are there any concerns about ideological weighting in LLMs? You have to tell me what LLM means.
Large language models. They're the AI, like the chatbots, like ChatGPT.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. The problem is you don't know what's going on in there. I mean, I use them all the time, but I don't think ideological. There's some, there'll be guardrails in there. There are certain questions they won't answer and so on. So yeah, there would be. Someone's in control of these. They've definitely got some angles. I'm actually more concerned about the quality of the information. And so, for example, if you ask them about statistical information, I'd like them to be going to a good source. So I think that's important. But no, the main problem about LLMs is that, who's in charge?
Okay. Who should be in charge?
Oh no, I'm not going to get in that either. I don't know. Yeah, no, that's really tricky. It's really tricky because it's such an open field. I mean, it's like saying who should be in charge of social media or stuff like that in
Well, do
that.
you think there should be a moratorium on these things? Are you in that camp
No, no, no. You
for
couldn't.
ethical
But I do.
responsibility?
I think that basically about this, there should be transparency in all of this, in the transparency in the algorithms.
But okay, let me try this question. You're probably going to throw it back at me and say I'm not going to answer it, but I'm just interested in the because AI is such a dominant phenomenon,
Mhm.
especially since Trump has just announced what is it, 6 billion or something, in an AI initiative. Just in terms of the moratorium, as to whether you think that there's a ethical free for all in this conversation,
I'm not. Can we talk about the book?
well, there was an
I'm not
AI
going to go
moment.
into that. Sorry, I'm not going to.
There
I'm
was
not
an
going
AI.
to.
It's all right. There
It's
was an
not my
AI moment.
job.
There was an AI moment in
I
the book.
sorry, I had to learn to deal with this in COVID. I did a huge number of interviews in COVID, and interviewers just try to pull me into what do you think about this policy and think, no, not going to answer.
Okay.
Talk to the hand.
Okay. Okay. What is David's view of the UK's Office for National Statistics, especially their future population and migration statistics? How accurate do you feel that they are, and how political could they become if they are not monitored by a third party?
Well, I mean, that is my responsibility. I'm on the board, for heaven's sake. So, yeah, I feel it's incredibly important. The best thing about ONS is they're not under a minister. They're a non-ministerial body. They're answerable directly to Parliament. So the third party is Parliament. They're the ones who monitor the ONS. Very future population. I mean, there's discussion now about whether we need another census. The last census went very well, so we've got a good idea of the current population. Migration is a real problem. The migration stats have not been good because they've been based on a survey. Is moving much more to administrative data, which should make them a lot better. There's a lot of work and attention going on to try to make sure they're as good as they can be. But again, number one priority of the ONS is trustworthiness and unbiasedness and not to have an agenda. And well, you can think what you like, but also ONS, has a very good trust rating, and I think quite rightly, because I can say I'm on the board, so I can say they do not have an agenda.
I'm going to draw you in again, and you can shout at me again if you want. But
I haven't shouted at all.
in, in terms of the general question about unconscious bias, how does that?
I know, no, no. Let's talk about the book.
Well,
I'm here to talk about the
no,
book.
David, I'm simply asking you about how
No, I'm
statistics.
not going to talk about it.
Okay, go blimey, right? Okay. Um, as a prospective medical student, I'm reading a lot about the potential of AI, yet a huge limitation seems to be the assumptions of the underlying
Mhm.
model and quality of the data
Yep.
on which the AI is trained. On
Oh,
top
yeah.
of that, they're usually commercially hidden. What
Yep.
advice would you have, particularly for medicine?
Yeah, very good. Very good question. Yeah, the point is, don't believe it. You got to check everything. You got to check everything, and it warns you about that. So yeah, you don't know where the information comes from. You don't know what it's dredged up from. You don't know what it's doing. So you got to take it with a huge pinch of salt. You got to treat it like you talk to somebody who, maybe has read a lot of books, but you never quite know whether they quite how they dealt with the information. So you have to check everything it says. You cannot rely on it.
What's the process when you say checking on everything? Because there has been a conversation about people, whether entering the dark web or wherever it is, people who want to check stuff, but then are checking in the wrong area, or it reinforces their own prejudices, or it misinterprets what should be. They're seeing the correct data as false, and then looking elsewhere for
Yeah,
real
you
data.
have to go to reliable, trustworthy sources, and that requires knowing something about what are reliable, trustworthy sources. And they do well. You've always got to use your judgment and things like that. You can't. There's not some great single arbiter of truth, but we're used to that. We're used to dealing with that in our lives all the time. There's no place you can go where you say, "Well, that is the absolute truth," because there's always judgment involved. But you need to weigh up and look for the best quality evidence.
And is that statistically read widely in order to come up with your understanding,
Oh
David?
yes, definitely, and understand about what potential biases of different sources. where they come from, what they're trying to do. So, I'd say you should go to the medical literature or the established medical guidelines, but you have to be careful about that as well. There's a lot of literature that isn't that great. So, I mean, it is a problem because I think I'm quite good at evaluating it because I've been doing it for 50 years. But it is a problem about, and I think it's sort of stuff should be taught in schools, is how to evaluate the trustworthiness of evidence of claims.
Yeah, I'm finding a lot of students these days who cite either Wikipedia or blogs, which
Well,
normally.
Wikipedia is not bad. Wikipedia is not bad because it is self-correcting to a large extent. Wikipedia is not too bad at all. Blogs, I wouldn't believe at all, but again, except for some people, I think it can be extremely good. Social media, during COVID, Twitter was an amazingly good source of information, but you had to know who to listen to because there's a whole lot of bollocks there as well.
Yeah. In an academic setting, I refuse to allow Wikipedia, but I appreciate the wisdom of crowds is appreciable on certain topics, but not in my experience on mine. I've got Dan who says he can't raise his hand. Dan, can you operate your microphone?
Yeah, I've actually read 2 chapters so far.
Oh, good.
I've got a very specific chapter about making decisions and managing risks, if
Oh,
that's
God.
okay.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And I think you explore strategies for navigating risk and uncertainty in that chapter.
Yeah.
That's as far as that. I mean, given the inherent unpredictability of continuous systems, what advice would you give for maintaining psychological and strategic continuity when decision making is disrupted?
Yeah, no, very good question. Again, I'm not qualified to answer. This is management behavior, risk management, and I'm a fellow of the Institute of Risk Management, for heaven's sake, or honorary, but I try to avoid it. So, I mean, I try to make clear that I'm not the whole thing of, what is the appropriate organizational strategies in the face of deeper uncertainty. I do talk about it a bit, but in a very limited way because I don't feel it's my main.
Can you give me some of the limited?
Oh, I see. Yeah. So, are you worried about thinking about systems which might be subject to abrupt or slow change?
Yeah, I'd say unexpected shocks or outcomes.
Yeah. No, I think that comes into the discussion of resilience that I do talk about quite a lot, and the fact that it's not a matter of rational decision making, of listing all the possible things that might happen and evaluating their probabilities. It's just impossible. It's not realistic to have that sort of rational approach because we can never think of all the things that might happen, all the shocks that might happen. So we should have a go at listing those, scenarios, and I talk about red teams of getting people in who deliberately take a rather pessimistic view, and talk about the Ministry of Defence who have write about red teams and employ science fiction writers to think of to give some idea of imagining all the possible shocks that might happen in the future. And that's incredibly valuable to think of that. But even with all of that, things that happen will still be things that you didn't think of. And so the push there is not to pretend that you can ever completely model that, completely understand it, completely mitigate all the risks in any way. So you needs to go for more resilient strategies that should be, should enable a recovery in the face of things that happen that you haven't even thought of, which always requires redundancy. Because you need to have supply lines, do multiple supply lines, and you need to do. You can't optimize. It's a disaster because then the whole system becomes very brittle. So that's the extent of my understanding of how to deal with those deeper uncertainties when you can't even list the possibilities, which is actually, the common situation.
Thank you.
Yeah, happy with that. Okay. Question here again on the text, if you would, David. How do those in the medical industry weigh up the risk of a disease to a person's health against the risk of a medical procedure? intended to remedy the disease? I think this is part of the ALARP type conversation you have in the book. Is it possible to statistically decide whether a potentially risky treatment should be administered, or are such choices best left to human intuition?
Absolutely. No, that's what NICE do. NICE have to do that all the time in deciding what treatments will be paid for under the NHS, because the MRHA decide whether a treatment may be given, but NICE decide whether it's going to be paid for. And their analyses take into account both the risks of the disease and the risks of the treatment. And there always is a trade-off. If you just think of going for surgery, you've got that trade-off of the risks of the disease against the risks of the intervention. So those trade-offs are absolutely standard in pretty well the whole of medicine, because almost every intervention will carry some side effect and possibly a very severe one. So NICE, when they do their analysis, do attempt to make that trade-off. So I think it's not only that people do it, they have to do it. I mean, that's just what you have to do. Now, of course, that's only a statistical analysis based on the population, based on average statistics, essentially. In anyone's real context, then there has to be an intervention, an extra human intervention, human judgment in there, as you said, because we're not all average. You know, some people might be susceptible to some particular harms more than others. Some people may be suffering from their disease more and may wish to take an extra risk in order to compensate for that. So you can't, you can do a sort of average analysis, but you cannot just apply that to the individual, who have to make their own informed choice about the treatment. And that's kind of, I think, pretty standard. And I think doctors are getting better at actually explaining this to people, rather than the paternalistic view of this is what you should do.
There's a reasonably famous example of a hospital being built, new hospital being built a fair few years ago, and they forgot to put in the sprinkler systems, or whatever. They did a cost-cutting measure, and to retrospectively fit the sprinklers was going to cost £12 million or something. And there was a general conversation about whether, because the risk of a fire in a hospital is incredibly low, whether spending £12 million on a sprinkler system would benefit people, or would you buy, I don't know, 20 dialysis machines or something, whatever the cost is. You know what I mean? There's that kind of risk-based analysis, about statistically based analysis about which would be the preferred.
You've got to be careful. I talk about that in the book when I'm talking about vaccines. You have to be careful about those sorts of trade-offs, because you quite often say, making decisions, you might be trading off statistical life, just you're reducing the chance of a future group of people coming to harm against some harm that might be done to people, and you know their name, you can identify who they are. And people, I think, feel quite differently about real lives and statistical lives. And mathematically, they may just balance each other. But I think in terms of policies, one needs to take into account that identifiable victims of something, whether it's in a fire or something, or from a vaccine, are quite rightly weighed more strongly in people's minds.
Yeah, it's the old plane crash versus the car crash story, isn't it? 3,000.
To some extent, no. I mean, one of the interesting ones is smart motorways. Now, smart motorways where there's no hard shoulder save lives, because there's more traffic on them. They take people off the A roads, and motorways are far safer than A roads. However, those are statistical lives. We never know. Nobody ever knows their life has been saved by a smart motorway. However, we do know when someone breaks down, is in the hard shoulder, and gets rammed by someone and killed, that quite rightly, that's everyone's idea of a horror. So that's given huge emotional salience, and I think quite rightly. So you cannot just do a statistical balance in these things. We need to take into account people's, and I talk about this in the book, people's, society's judgments about, the philosophers have analyzed this about, train crashes and things like that. The Rail Safety Board employed a philosopher to look into, why do people want to spend so much money on safety when it's not worth it? And he said, well, when there's a train crash and people are killed, there's an absolute, people are really appalled. This should not happen. These things should not happen to people. And so there's, I think, quite an appropriate societal reaction against things that, even rare events that lead to catastrophic harm to a group of people.
And there is a numerical value in human life, isn't there? In the calculation.
Yeah, it used to be about 1.3. I think it's about 1.8 million now. Value of a statistical life. So it's not an identifiable individual, but so it's how much, if you think that a road improvement is going to save 2 lives over the next 10 years, or on average that you expect from a model, then you're willing to spend 3 million quid on it or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's Department of Transport who've got a value of a statistical life, but NICE do that as well. I mean, it used to be 20,000 quid for that the NHS is willing to pay for a good quality year of life for somebody. It doesn't seem to have gone up for years. So I think that's a bit of sort of I'm not sure whether it's still the same, but that is in calculations about whether the treatment's worth paying for under the NHS.
Yeah. But they're also culturally specific. Obviously, the value of a human life for the developing world would be far less than maybe we consider it over here. Would you say?
Yeah.
So let me just go back here. We got. Sorry, let me just quickly see. Has anybody got a live question? I don't know why I'm reading.
Yeah,
these
can we have
out.
a question about the book?
Well, some of the people wouldn't have read it yet, David. That's
All right.
Partly the purpose of this conversation is to encourage them. But let me quickly go on here. I'm more minded of the fact that I don't know why I'm reading them out, why people aren't sticking their hand up. How do we regain faith in the ONS after some of the data collected in the last census was downgraded amid concern some people may not have understood the question properly due to language barriers? Given the lapse of data collection, how do we determine suitable alternatives, and how do we collect information to avoid our decision making being skewed by incidents such as this? Is that one for you, David?
Yeah, ONS really screwed up. The question about trans identity was badly worded and was misunderstood by some people in the population whose English was not great. Scotland asked us a very simple question: "Are you trans?" and got a good answer. Yeah, in terms of the statistics, it doesn't make much difference. Both Scotland and Britain, on average, came out about 1 in 200 as trans. So the magnitude of the difference is not that great, but it was not a great question. And so what happened is that one bit of the census data now are not considered as official statistics. So it was a mess. Yeah, absolutely. It's a very small thing. I mean, it's really bad that it happened. Absolutely. And one would hope that it wouldn't happen again. But again, it was almost fortunate that Scotland used a different form of the question, because we actually showed that works. And I hope that's what people would do in future.
Okay. Final question here from Georgina saying, I asked Professor Spiegelhalter this question 4 years ago.
Oh, God.
In front of my maths teacher, ! But does he feel that the need for practical tuition to be given a higher priority in the school curriculum? I'm in an age-appropriate way, risk and uncertainty in particular, but also the use of numbers to misdirect and manipulate. P.S. My maths teacher isn't here tonight.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah, no, it's still a real issue. So I've been on a working party from the Royal Society on the future of mathematical education, and we've proposed renaming maths MDE, mathematical and data education. So a major part of the education would be about data literacy. In other words, the ability to understand claims made on the basis of data, critique them, take them apart, to do data analysis, of course, but crucially in order to live as a modern citizen in a society where where we are bombarded by claims of dubious quality right around in social media and elsewhere. And I think it's very strong. It should be part of education to equip kids with not to just have to use their gut feelings about the skepticism, but know how to take a claim, the sort of questions to take the claim apart, which we mentioned before. And so I hope this will happen. So, and this includes sort of statistical analysis and things like that, but it's both doing data and critiquing claims based on data. And that means always, dealing with risk and uncertainty and the claims made about that. So I really hope that this becomes part of the curriculum. The discussion of whether, it's not really part of maths. We use some maths, but it's not really part of maths, but not really part of anything, where in a way it belongs in every subject. You should be able to critique claims that are being made. So it's a bit of an issue about how it quite fit in, but I think it's absolutely essential for the future, so that maths is not just, good old-fashioned geometry and algebra and all those lovely things.
But does that include research methods? I mean, you have
Yeah, no, but that should
way.
be part of science. It is part of science to some extent anyway, but that should be part of the scientific curriculum, is the scientific method and research methods, randomized trials and so on. How can we actually determine the reasons for things going on and what is going on? So that is already, I would, is part of the science curriculum, but that should be strengthened as well. Yeah.
Okay. Georgina has an addendum just typed in saying, and also be better equipped to be a patient P401 on informed consent.
Yeah, exactly, because patients should be able to ask appropriate questions about the harms and potential harms and benefits of treatments, and get a good answer and expect a good answer. It might not always be, it won't be precise numerical, but it should give a feeling of what's known about something. And so I think it's absolutely, this is the empower, it sounds, it's a cliched phrase, but the empowered citizen, we can't just be passive recipients of what's thrown at us by, media and by doctors.
Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult balancing act, though, isn't it? The idea that, we do want to trust our doctors rather than question everything.
No, but you absolutely, but one of the main ways in which they can essentially deserve that trust or show their reason for trusting it is by engaging the patient in the decision that's being made. But because for some patients, that's not what they want. Some would actually welcome a paternalist point of view. But I think doctors now are increasingly being trained in what's called shared decision making, and so that if people do want to engage with the choice, they can do it and be properly informed. Now, maybe they don't, and that's completely fine. If people would rather say, "Well, what do you think I should do, doctor?" That's completely fine, and then the doctor is quite entitled to give his opinion about what should be done. But that shouldn't just be the starting point. It shouldn't be, because that's pure paternalism to say, well, what you should do is X. And I think things are changing away from that.
Yeah, fair enough. Can I ask you a question just in terms of the uncertainty concept itself? Because you say that in general we have to make our own judgments, what we've just been talking about. We need to own our uncertainty, you say, to positively welcome it as providing an opportunity for learning and change. I can't agree more, but there is a question as to how that's interpreted as reinforcing relativism, how you kind of fight against reinforcing relativism by basically arguing that we need to have our own judgments and we're not certain about
that is a really good point, and I feel sometimes I got to be careful because by taking a rather personalistic view of this, and that our judgments are at the core of and you can lead to the absurd, I think, distance, and that is a relativist position that everyone's opinion is equally valid and so on, which is, I think, absurd. So obviously everyone does have absolutely right to their opinion, but if it's a matter of fact or a judgment about something that is verifiable, then some people do know more than others. And so it's not like it's black or white, this thing. And in the book I try to set a balance by saying that our uncertainty is something we own ourselves, but at the same time, there is evidence. There is evidence out there, and that should change our uncertainty. That we should revise our beliefs on the basis of evidence that received. Now, how much we weigh that evidence in a sense, is also a judgment. In other words, who we listen to and how much notice we take of them, or what facts we might use. But there are established ways of doing that. If you're using evidence from trustworthy sources, use Bayes' theorem essentially, but there is a valid way of combining sources of evidence in order to change your opinion. Of course, some people might start from different places, but if the evidence is strong enough, they should be brought together. And that's Bayesian statistics, which is what I've worked on for ages. And so I suppose within that world, which I've worked in for years, you always do have this slightly uneasy tension between an acknowledgement that it's all subjective. I mean, I don't actually, I'm not quite convinced there is a reality out there anyway. So we construct things, we construct our understanding. Actually don't believe that I have a self. So we can get onto. I don't want to get onto all that now, but so everything we construct our understanding of the world. However, on the other hand, some constructions are better than others because some evidence is more reliable, and we can't just choose exactly. So I use that as my example in that. Well, I could say I got a 98% probability that I can fly off the roof. I use that in the book, and I can quite reasonable that I have that probability. However, if I try, I'll find, especially if I find it's not a very good judgment, and so we're entitled to our judgments, our personal judgments, as long as we then validate them against reality.
That sounds fairly reasonable. I'm not necessarily about the "do I exist" question. That's probably, probably a bit too deep for tonight.
Yeah, exactly.
There's one final thing which came up here. Again, it's not a question; it's just a point, I think, from Terry saying trust the citizens and trust the experts are complementary, as in the COVID graph on page 390.
Oh, yeah, that was the benefits and harms of the AstraZeneca vaccine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, which I worked on. And we did the graphics for Jonathan Van Tam when he was recommending that the vaccine shouldn't be given to younger people. So we did the data analysis and graphics for him. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what we got? How do you personally improve your luck? Do you have any rituals that you do?
No, but I do talk in the book about rituals. Ed Smith, who's a Test cricketer, has written a book on luck, and he talks about what he used to do before every ball. When he was batting, he would touch his cap and he would pull his gloves up, and he'd go through this sort of performance every time before he received every ball. And he thought, what was I doing with all this fiddling about? And then, of course, he was very unlucky and got injured during a match and had to withdraw from Test cricket. So, I mean, also write in the book about research by Richard Wiseman and others about what makes lucky people. So I don't do, actually, maybe I wonder if I do some rituals. I mean, it's the rituals are perhaps the checking, because to prevent disasters, so I improve my luck by actually checking that I've got everything with me. I got the keys with me, I got my wallet, I got things. So actually, some degree, I like a checklist or something like that. You could say it's a ritual. It's actually a really good way of avoiding unforeseen circumstances. But the other way, really, the people who are lucky, who people consider lucky, they don't have so much rituals, I think, as just an outlook on life, which is to do with spotting opportunities, looking at not being fixed in a particular way of thinking, being adaptable, and having an element of boldness, of trying things.
Because you talk about the old Rumsfeld quote about unknowns and all the rest of it. But the luck thing, do you know what I mean? Like that unpredictability or the unforeseeability of what luck is. I'm just a lucky kind of person because this happened to me. Are you manipulating the idea of luck if you then say, I can try to take care of those things I can foresee, and that will improve my luck? Is that still luck?
No, I don't believe that luck exists as some external force. I can't manipulate luck. What I can do is try to prevent bad things happening, which may be reduce the risk of things happening, which would later on I would look back on and say, well, that was unlucky. Of course, it wasn't just unlucky because I would have been careless in some way. But luck I regard as something that's purely viewed retrospectively. I don't believe it's some force in the outside world. It's just a label we put on past events which turned out well or turned out badly. So when I say trying to reduce the role of luck, I'm just saying trying to reduce the risk of things going badly.
Yeah. It's like that story of the guy walking down the street and the slate falls off the roof and slices his arm off, and then says, "I'm very lucky. If it had been 2 inches the other way, it would have gone chopped, taken my head off." And somebody then pointed out, if he'd gone 2 inches the other way, it would have missed him altogether. Luck is very ill-determined in that sense. Right. Yeah, one final. Do you want to just quickly give an example you give of Derren Brown? Because it's just a fantastic example. Maybe what we've just been talking about.
I
really.
showed the video in a talk yesterday. I think it's fascinating. I don't remember Derren Brown did his shows. I don't know, you may have seen the program The System, which was on 10, 15 years ago, I think. And in it, he says, right, I'm going to flip a coin 10 times and it's going to come up heads every time. And he stands there and in a single take, he does it. He flips a coin 10 times into a bowl, a proper flip, and it comes up heads every time. And he just says 10 heads and looks very pleased with himself. It looks very smug and pleased with himself. And of course, later, I showed that clip yesterday. I asked you, okay, how did he do it? How did he do it? And people go, oh, the coin was biased. They changed the editing. He said, no. And then someone got it. Well, maybe he actually took a long time to do it. And later on in the program, Derren Brown reveals he took 9 hours of flipping before he got his 10 heads in a row, which shows an amazing professionalism, because the clip they actually used after 9 hours, which was just a minute, looks like it was the first time. He just looked so cool, and yet he must be getting so excited and getting close to it. So he was really professional. It took 9 hours it took him. And so I always ask, was he unlucky or lucky to take 9 hours? And it turns out he was really unlucky to take 9 hours. My friend did it in an hour. And it's on YouTube, the most boring YouTube video you could ever want to watch. He stood there and he flipped a coin in an hour. He'd got 10 heads in a row. So, and you can work out, roughly on average, it should take 1,000 flips, because it's a 1 in 1,000 attempts, not 1,000 flips, 1,000 attempts, because there's a 1 in 1,000 chance of flipping 10 heads in a row. And he took about, Derren Brown, I think, took about 1,600 attempts, I worked out. So he was pretty unlucky. And my friend was rather lucky. So I wouldn't recommend it. But you can do it. If you just start, if you've got a day to spare, just flip away and you should get 10 heads in a row.
That's what everybody's now going to do for the rest of the evening.
I hope not. Yeah.
Right. I've got one point here from this is Georgina again.
Oh yeah.
Where did you get your two? You have a two.
Yeah, no, I don't know if you can see it. It's beautiful. Look at that £2 coin. It's a beautifully made £2 coin as well.
Do you ever bet on tails?
Sorry?
Do you ever bet on tails?
No, because I flip it and then I try to get the audience to bet on tails. But it's a good example, because I flip that and ask them what's the probability it's going to be heads, and then later on they say half, and I say, well, no, it's 2 heads. So it shows that probability they were using was based on trusting me, which is very rash. But it shows any numerical probability you give is always based on assumptions. They were making assumptions, they're making judgments. That probability was a construction. So it's a nice example. I can't remember where I got it. I think I got it in a magic shop somewhere, or I might have got it online. You can buy them online. They're quite expensive because they're illegal. it takes a bit of work to make a nice one. Yeah.
Yeah. You would have thought it would cost £4 just to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Save in half.
Yeah, no, because that day it would have cost £4 to make, but no, I think you pay a bit more than that.
All right, look, very good, David. I think that's we've come to the end. So look, just very quickly to say, this is the book for everyone. The Age of Uncertainty, the Art of Uncertainty. I beg your pardon. Although it is the Age of Uncertainty, the Art of Uncertainty. And there's some great examples, I think, in the book, from the Derren Brown example, the trickery that's been used, to betting on horses. All these are very good little snapshots of how you can interpret these statistical devices into your everyday life. But also it's a wider conversation, I think, that I think we should be more inquisitive about. the rise of, as I was saying before, the rise of more or less on the BBC Verify services, not including Mariana Spring herself, but more and more people, I think, are trying to work things out for themselves, which is only a good thing. But sometimes we can disappear down rabbit holes and give up believing in anything. So hold on to your hats when you read the book. The Art of Uncertainty. Links to Amazon are on the chat function. And also, if you want to make a donation for the Barnies in the future and now, please feel free. But can we have a quick unmute and a round of applause for David, please? Cracking.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well done,
Thank you.
David. Well done,
Yeah,
David.
no, thanks very much. And if
So-
anyone does read it, I hope you enjoy the book.
Well, I'm sure they will, as much as I did. And apologies for trying to steer you off into the
Yeah, I won't be
other
like
world.
I
I
got
will not-
used to it. I got used to it. I'm not going to be saying that's fine. That's fine.
You're a terrible man. You're a terrible man. Anyway, very good, David. Thank you very much indeed. It's a really excellent conversation, and I wish you all the very best in the future.
No, thanks so much. Great
Take care now.
questions. Thank you.
Bye bye now. Bye bye. Bye bye.